Okay, this is our fifth and final video in this series on contractual certainty. And so what we want to do now is talk about what the consequences are if any of the three uncertainty tests are not met. So what's next? Let's remind ourselves of where we sit, and it's the boxes in blue here from our overall map. So it's really regardless of which of the sorry about that, three elements are not met, then we consider really pretty much the same consequences. Can we sever the offending term, or can we waive the offending term? And if we can do either of those things, do we end up with a contract that makes sense? And if we do, will we still have a contract and the test isn't failed entirely? But if we can't, no contract, go back to first principles. So consequences really fall into these three different groups. So firstly, if we need to ask ourselves whether the agreement is void, or is void. So if the incomplete, uncertain, or illusory provision is an essential provision, then the contract must fail. Then there is no contract, it is void. However, if the relevant provision is not essential, then the next question is whether the court can infer an intention that the agreement should be valid in the absence of that provision. So let's just look first at agreement being void. Essentially what that means is none of the agreement can be enforced. Typo in that slide, I've just seen it now. And Whitlock and Brew is a really good example of that happening. So if, though, we can consider that the relevant provision isn't an essential provision, then we might ask ourselves whether it can be severed. So if the term is severed, we could find a valid contract if the term is not an essential term. But if the ineffective term is an essential term, then we have no contract. But if the ineffective term by itself is unenforceable and the rest of the agreement makes sense, then it can be performed or enforced. The next option is whether a term can be waived. And so that's really going to look to the being able to determine which party had the benefit of that potentially illusory term. So look, let me give you an example. Say a contract for the purchase of a house is subject to finance, in other words, the purchaser getting finance, but it's put in such a way as to render the finance, that clause, completely unfettered. One of the options is for the purchaser to just waive that requirement and then say, okay, it's not subject to finance anymore. I'm the party who had the benefit of that clause. That clause might be unenforceable. Doesn't matter. I don't care. I waive whatever rights I might have had under it. Then the question becomes, is the contract by itself enforceable with the information that we have? So your textbook refers to the case of Grime and Bartholomew, Supreme Court of New South Wales decision. And in that case, they held that a party cannot waive an uncertain clause that is essential to the contract because the uncertainty means the parties fail to reach an agreement at all. Since there's no contract, no right of waiver can arise. However, there are other cases that find differently from that, where the term that is being waived is not an essential term. So because the term is not essential, the contract doesn't fail absolutely. It's not void, as in that first category. But instead the contract can be reread or written with that term excluded. One of the things that you will see quite regularly if you're looking at contract documents, and one of the things I'd really encourage you to do about this point of your career is to go into the Australian Encyclopedia of Forms and Precedents and have a look at the boilerplate clause. And you'll see that in the boilerplate clauses there are waiver or severance clauses as well, which tend to set out the basis on which a clause will be able to be severed from an agreement if it's unenforceable for some reason. So, returning to where we were just a minute ago, the key issue here for you at a formation level is to ask, when will the whole of the contract be void? Factors leading to a conclusion that a whole contract will be void really go to whether or not the term is an essential term or not. This is something that we will come back to again when we talk about construction of a contract and identification of the terms of a contract. So if an essential term has been omitted, in other words, the contract is incomplete, and a court is unwilling to supply the replacement terms, which will be in most cases, um, or if it can be inferred that the party's intention was that there would be no agreement without the term, then the whole of the contract will be void. And when can the ineffective term be severed? Factors leading to that conclusion it really go to the question of whether the term was essential or not. If it can be inferred from the parties, from the conduct or the words of the parties, that their intention was that there would remain a valid agreement without the ineffective term, hence the common boilerplate provisions that deal with what happens if an individual term is ineffective. And lastly, that the performance of other terms of the agreement have been partially or wholly completed. Take a look at your textbook at 6.65 about that. And when we talk about formalities in the next series, we will talk a little bit about the part performance doctrine as well. And then that's all I really have to say about completeness or certainty. We will be doing some exercises in class, and there will be some materials on the discussion board to push this further along. But the next thing for you to do is start looking at the videos that I am, in fact, at the time I say this, yet to make about formalities. But they'll be there for you any minute. Cheers.